The painting that changed itself and showed what someone had done in the past. Have you ever imagined restoring a work of art and realizing that it changes on its own, revealing week after week a dark story from the past? That's exactly what happened to Helena. It all began as an ordinary painting, a family by a lake, but then something changed. First, a hand holding something metallic appeared, then the sky darkened, until the scene revealed a brutal crime and in the background, a very familiar face. This is the story of a painting that refused to be silent, demanding the truth about a forgotten murder from a descendant. If you love mystery, psychological tension and chilling stories, now leave a like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because today we're going to dive into a story that seems to have come straight out of a movie, but could very well happen to you. Helena's studio was silent that morning. The smell of turpentine and polished wood mingled with the dust drifting in through the open window. The art restorer had grown accustomed to the slow pace of her work. Layers of varnish carefully removed, invisible brushstrokes restoring the lifetime had taken from the works. But this piece was different. The delivery man arrived early, carrying a long, heavy box. When Helena removed the package, she found a dark, ornately carved wooden frame covered in years of dust. The painting, dating from the 19th century, depicted a pastoral scene. A family sitting on the grass, a lake in the background, a clear, tranquil sky. At first glance, it was an innocent, almost bucolic scene. However, something bothered her from the first glance. The character's eyes seemed to follow her around the room. Not obviously, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but whenever she moved, she felt as if she were being watched. She left the painting leaning against the wall and spent the entire day feeling as if she wasn't alone in the studio. When the work finally began, the first strokes of solvent revealed vivid colors beneath the yellow of the old varnish. The character's clothes came to life. The green of the grass shone again. The lake reflected the sky clearly. Helen felt proud. It was like bringing the past back to life. But there was one disturbing detail, the expression of the woman portrayed. Beneath the dirt, her face was too serious for someone at a picnic. Her eyes were unsympathetic. The child held a bouquet of flowers, but her posture was rigid, almost uncomfortable. That night, as she closed the studio, Helena turned to turn off the light and swore the child's position seemed slightly different, as if she were a few inches closer to her mother. She shook her head, laughed at herself, and left. But for the first time in years, she locked the door twice. Over the next few days, he continued working. The painting took on a new shine, as if it had been painted yesterday. The client would be delighted. But something inside her resisted parting with the piece. It was as if the canvas had a story to tell and wasn't yet ready for delivery. Deep down, Helena felt that the painting wasn't just returning to its original form, it was waking up. The next morning, Helena arrived early at the studio. Soft sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air. There was something almost sacred about that moment. The restored painting seemed to glow on its own on the wall, as if it had returned to time. Helena smiled with satisfaction. This was her work in its purest form, bringing life back to what had been forgotten. But as she approached for a final inspection, something stopped her in her tracks. The lower right corner looked different. Yesterday, she remembered clearly, there had been a dark stain there, perhaps old grime that still needed to be removed. But now the space was clean, and worse. In the stain's place, there was something new. She frowned and picked up the inspection glass. What she saw made her stomach churn. A small male hand had appeared in the painting, holding something that hadn't been there before, a metal object, perhaps a tool or a blade. Helena felt her heart race. She ran to the computer, opened the photos she had taken during the restoration process, and compared the images. There was no doubt that detail was new. It hadn't been there either in the painting's initial state or when she had finished cleaning it. For a few seconds, she stood still, staring at the canvas, the sound of her own heart echoing in her ears. Logic told her it was impossible. Paint doesn't appear out of thin air. Perhaps it was a detail she simply hadn't noticed before. But her memory was trained to observe every brushstroke, every crack. There was no way she could be wrong. Most disturbing was the sensation that followed. A shiver ran down her spine, as if someone were standing behind her, watching her reaction. She turned suddenly, but the studio was empty. "I'm getting too impressed," she muttered to herself, trying to rationalize. In the following days, she returned to her normal work, but something had changed inside her. She spent more time looking at the painting than at any other piece in the studio. It was as if she was waiting for something else to happen, and it did. The following week, another detail emerged. The sky, once blue and calm, was now covered in grey clouds. The scene seemed to have subtly darkened, as if an invisible shadow were growing within the screen. Helena began having trouble sleeping. She would close her studio, and when she got home, she felt as if she had forgotten something important, as if the painting were calling her. One night, she dreamed she was inside the painting, sitting by the lake. A man's hand would appear from behind her and hold the metal object, but before she could turn to see who it was, she would wake up gasping. It was impossible to deny. The painting was changing on its own, and she was the only witness. And strangely, despite her fear, part of Helena wanted to see how far this would go. The changes began to follow a pattern. Every Monday upon entering the studio, Helena noticed something different in the painting. It was as if the canvas chose a specific day to transform. The first detail had been the hand, the second the cloudy sky. And now, in the third week, there was something new. An axe, leaning against the tree in the background. The impact was immediate. Helena stood motionless before the canvas, her eyes fixed on an object that simply hadn't existed before. The axe was perfectly painted, its blade reflecting the light from the lake so realistically that it seemed to have been placed there on purpose. She began photographing the work daily, trying to capture even the slightest change. She created a folder on her computer called Evidence, as if compiling a dossier of something no one would ever believe. But with each new recording, the fear grew. By the fourth week, the man depicted in the painting seemed to have aged. Deep wrinkles had appeared on his face, and his once serene gaze had grown heavy, almost menacing. By the fifth week, the sky had darkened even further, and the lake lost its reflection. It was now just a dark, lifeless stain. Helena began to avoid being alone in the studio at night. The shadows seemed to lengthen when she looked at the painting. The ambient sound also changed. The room seemed quieter, as if drowning out the sounds outside. The worst part was when she noticed something almost imperceptible. The child in the painting was now a little further away from her mother, looking in the man's direction, and her eyes, previously pure innocence, now looked frightened. It was during that week that Helena began having recurring nightmares. She dreamed she was on the painting set, but this time she couldn't move. The axe was in the man's hands, and she sensed something terrible was about to happen. She always woke up before seeing what was coming next. During the day, she tried to convince herself she was dealing with some chemical phenomenon, perhaps an ancient reaction of the paints to the solvent, or even a misperception. But at night, alone, she knew it was more than that. The painting wasn't just changing, it was telling a story. And worse, he seemed to want her to watch until the end. In the sixth week, Helena entered the studio with her heart already racing. She couldn't decide whether to be more anxious or frightened by what she would find. The painting looked different even before she turned on the lights. There was something in the darkness, a sense that the characters were already waiting for her. When the light finally shone in the room, he saw that the woman in the picture was no longer smiling. In fact, she now had her back turned, facing the depths of the forest, as if fleeing or hiding something. The man, on the other hand, seemed larger, his posture more menacing, and the axe was now in his hand. Helena took a step back, her body trembling, and that was when she heard it. Footsteps, slow, shuffling, coming from the hallway. The sound approached the studio door and stopped. She stood still, her heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo in the room. "Is anyone there?" he asked in a trembling voice. The silence was absolute, but out of the corner of her eye something caught her attention, the reflection in the painting's frame. For a second, she saw a silhouette standing behind her, tall and motionless. When she turned, no one was there. The following days were worse. Objects in the studio began to move. A brush that Helena always left next to her paints was found on the floor, as if it had been thrown. The lights flickered at night, even though the wiring was in perfect working order, and the sound of footsteps repeated itself, always at the same time, shortly after midnight. One night, as she finished cataloguing photographs of the changes in the painting, Helena felt something cold touch the back of her neck. She turned suddenly and, for a moment, swore she saw the man in the painting reflected in the studio window. His gaze seemed to pierce her. Fear began to mix with a strange sense of obsession. Part of her wanted to get rid of the painting immediately, but another part couldn't. It was as if she were mesmerized by the unfolding story. Each week revealed a new piece of a dark puzzle, and she needed to know how it would end. Helena stopped bringing visitors to the studio. She didn't want anyone to see the painting. It was hers and hers alone to bear the privilege and burden of witnessing its revelation. But deep down, I felt that I was no longer alone in that place. Every Monday, the studio transformed into a stage for revelation. Helena spent the entire weekend anxiously wondering what she would find on the canvas when she returned, but nothing prepared her for what she saw in the 7th week. The sky in the painting was nearly black, heavy with menacing clouds. The lake, once blue and bright, now looked like a pool of ink without any reflection. The man had taken a few steps forward. He was no longer in the background, but very close to the woman. And the axe, previously only in his hands, was now raised as if about to fall. The woman looked terrified. Even painted in 19th century brushstrokes, her expression was clear. And the child was now kneeling, the flowers fallen to the ground, her eyes wide. Helena recoiled, her heart racing. The story the painting was telling was no longer a question. It was a crime, a tragedy that revealed itself in weekly fragments, as if the canvas were a confession diary. It was that night that Helena dreamed again. She was inside the painting's setting, smelling the wet grass, feeling the chill of the wind on her face. The man stood behind her, holding the axe, his breathing audible and heavy. When she turned, she saw something that woke her with a scream. The man's face was blurred, featureless, as if he still didn't want to reveal himself completely. Determined to find out more, Helena began investigating the painting's origins. She discovered it had been painted by a little-known artist, Emiliano Farias, who lived in isolation on a farm in the late 19th century. The painter's biography was murky. Rumors claimed he witnessed a tragedy involving a family of settlers and was never the same afterward. Shortly thereafter, he died. Mysteriously, alone, with his studio locked from the inside. The pieces began to fall into place. Helena realized that the painting wasn't just depicting an ordinary scene, it was documenting something real, perhaps the very murder the artist had witnessed. The feeling of being used grew within her. The painting seemed to want her to be not just a spectator, but a spokesperson for a forgotten history. And Helena, as scared as she was, couldn't stop. She needed to see the next chapter, needed to know who the man was and who had died in that scene. By the 8th week, upon entering the studio, Helena could already feel the air getting colder. It was as if the canvas itself was breathing. In the 8th week, Helena entered the studio earlier than usual. She hadn't been able to sleep the night before. She sensed something important was about to be revealed. The air felt heavy, almost metallic, and the silence was so thick she could hear her own heartbeat. When he turned on the lights, his breath caught. The scene in the painting had changed drastically. It was no longer just an implicit tension. Now it was explicit. The body lay on the ground. The woman knelt, weeping over it. The man stood, his axe smeared with red, staring straight ahead with a blank, almost cold expression. It was the first time the painting had shown blood, and the scarlet stain on the grass seemed so vivid it might drip off the canvas. Helena felt her legs weaken. She had to lean on the table to keep from falling. The scene seemed pulsating, alive, as if she could hear the woman's crying and the distant sound of thunder announcing a storm. That night, the nightmare was worse than ever. He dreamed he was standing exactly as the painting depicted the man. He could feel the heavy axe in his hands, the metallic smell of blood, the weight of the deed. When he looked at the body on the ground, he saw the victim's face for the first time, and it was a relative. It was the face of an ancestor of hers. An old photo Helena remembered seeing in the family album. She woke in a cold sweat, her mind reeling, trying to understand how it was possible. Determined, she went to her mother's attic and searched through her old albums. There it was, a sepia-toned photo of a man who looked very much like the one in the painting, holding a hoe. On the back of the photo was a note: Manuel disappeared in 1892. Helena felt a deep chill. It couldn't be a coincidence. The painting was showing something directly, connected to her own story. It was as if the painting had waited decades to reach her, so she could finally tell what happened. When she returned to the studio the next morning, she found something even more disturbing. In the bottom corner of the frame, where there had been nothing before, there was now a signature that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the painter's. It was a name she recognized immediately: your surname. The connection between her and the crime was sealed. The following week, Helena barely had the courage to open the studio, but something inside her kept pushing her forward, as if an invisible force demanded her presence. When she turned on the lights, the impact was immediate. The scene had changed again. This time, there was a new detail. In the background of the painting, among the trees, a face stood out. It was smaller, almost hidden, but clear enough to be recognized. Helena felt her stomach churn. It was familiar. He approached with the magnifying glass, his hands shaking. With each passing second, the resemblance became clearer. The facial features, the shape of the eyes, the chin. It was like looking at an old photo of his father. Helena recoiled, her hand covering her mouth. It was impossible. Her father had never mentioned any ancestors who were murderers or involved in crime. But deep down, a vague memory returned to her mind, stories her grandmother had told about a mistake the family had tried to erase, something that should never be mentioned. Over the next few days, Helena delved into old records, newspapers, and online archives. She discovered fragments of a rural scandal involving a land dispute in the late 19th century, which ended in an unsolved death. The description of the suspect, a strong, hard-working man from a respected family, matched the features of the man in the painting. That night, upon returning home, Helena saw something that made her freeze. In her bedroom window, reflected in the glass, was the same face that lurked in the painting. There was no one behind her. From that day on, the obsession became personal. She wasn't just a curious restorer faced with a mysterious work. She was a descendant confronted by a family secret. With each new change in the canvas, she felt as if she were being judged, as if her own bloodline was demanding a response. And then, in the 9th week, the face in the background of the painting no longer looked just like her father's. It looked like hers. The features, the eyebrows, even the expression. It was as if the canvas were saying, "You are part of it." Helena didn't know whether to feel fear, guilt, or compassion, but she knew the painting wasn't finished speaking, and that when it did, she would need to decide what to do with that truth. By the 9th week, the air in the studio felt as heavy as lead. Helena smelled damp wood and candle smoke as soon as she opened the door, even though there were no candles lit. When she looked at the painting, her entire body shivered. The scene was different, but this time there was no dramatic movement, no new blood. Everything was still, as if history had frozen in its throes. The man was kneeling, the axe lying beside him, his hands covered in red. The woman, still with her back turned, appeared to be crying. The child had vanished from the scene, as if she had run out of the frame. But the most disturbing thing was the man's gaze. For the first time, his eyes were turned away from the screen, staring directly at whoever stood before her. Helena felt a chill run down her spine. That look seemed to be pleading. There was no anger, no defiance. There was pain, a silent plea. That night, the dream was different. Instead of witnessing the crime, she was sitting at the painter's table, watching him work. His hands moved quickly, tracing almost desperate brush strokes, as if he were trying to capture something before it was too late. In the background, a male voice repeated a phrase, low and drawn. Out, "Tell the truth." Helena woke with tears streaming down her face. She felt it was no longer just a historical curiosity or a family mystery. The painting was demanding something from her. It wanted her to give voice to what had been silenced for over a century. The next day, she spent hours standing in front of the canvas, alone, as if waiting for an answer. And then she heard it. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a whisper, barely audible, coming from every corner of the studio at once. He wasn't guilty. Helena fell to her knees. The weight of those words hit her like a blow. What the painting was depicting was not just a crime, but an injustice. Perhaps the man had been accused of something he hadn't done. Perhaps his death, his reputation, or the disappearance of his story had been a mistake perpetuated over time. That night, Helena wrote in her diary for the first time about what was happening. No longer as a scientific observer, but as someone on a mission. She knew she needed to let the painting speak its full course, even if it meant confronting truths her family had buried. When she closed the studio, she had the distinct feeling that someone was beside her. Not a hostile presence, but someone waiting patiently, as if the man in the painting himself were there, watching to make sure she didn't give up. The silence on the screen was no longer empty. It was the silence of someone who had just confessed and was now waiting to be absolved. In the 10th week, dawn, I felt different. Helena felt a pressure in her chest as soon as she opened her eyes, as if the painting itself were calling her back to the studio. She barely had breakfast. She went straight there, her hands trembling, and the feeling that this would be the day everything would be resolved. Upon entering, he found the room unusually dim. Even though it was a bright morning, the windows seemed darker, and the sound of the street outside was muffled, as if the entire world had been silenced for that moment. As he approached the painting, he noticed something about it had radically changed. Now the characters were lined up, all looking directly out of the canvas. The man, the woman, and even the child, who had returned to the scene. But there was no blood. There was no axe. The scene seemed calmer. except for their gazes, which carried a weight impossible to ignore. At the bottom of the screen, something new had appeared. Almost invisible letters, as if they had been written overnight. He was not innocent. Helena felt her stomach turn. Until that moment, she had believed the painting was trying to clear the man's name to prove he was innocent. But now the painting seemed to say the opposite. He had committed the crime. The woman and child were not silent victims of fate. They were witnesses. The revelation hit her like a hammer. Suddenly, all the family stories she'd heard made sense. The silence, the evasive glances, the pages torn from photo albums. The man in the painting was the ancestor who had disappeared, and the reason for his disappearance wasn't an unsolvable mystery. It was shame. The tears came uncontrollably, not because she was angry, but because she felt the weight of an untold story, a truth that had been buried for generations, and now it was there, before her, demanding to be remembered. That night, Helena had the most intense dream of all. She was standing before the man, whose face now became clear. He held out his hands to her, not as if asking for help, but as if accepting his fate. Behind him, the woman held the child and nodded, as if giving permission. Upon waking, Helena knew what she had to do. She had to let that story be known, let the truth be told, not to condemn, but to free the memory of all who lived and died with that secret. The painting had fulfilled its function. It didn't just want to show, it wanted to be a testimony, and Helena, chosen or not, would be the bearer of this confession. The next morning, the sun seemed brighter, but for Helena, the day held a solemn weight. She knew this would be the last time she would enter the studio to see the painting. The smell of varnish, normally comforting, seemed charged with something sacred, almost ritualistic. The painting stood there, silent but different. The characters seemed at peace. The man no longer carried the axe. The woman's eyes were fixed on the lake, and the child was holding the flowers again, just as it had been the first time Helena had restored the canvas. But the man's face still looked outward, as if waiting for something from her. Helena took a deep breath and made her decision. She couldn't simply sell it or return it to the client. The work had served its purpose, and now she needed to rest. She loaded the painting into her car and drove to the old, abandoned chapel perched high on a hill, a place her grandmother used to visit when she wanted to talk to the dead. The interior of the chapel was dusty and silent, but the remnants of candles and images of saints still hung on the peeling walls. Helena placed the painting on the altar, lit 7 candles around it, and knelt before it. "I heard," he said softly, tears welling up. "The story has been told. You are no longer forgotten." As she finished speaking, a gust of wind blew through the broken window and blew out all the candles at once. The silence that followed was so profound that she felt a chill run down her spine. As she stood to leave, she took one last look at the painting and gasped. Something had changed. The lake was serene, the sky was blue again, and all the characters were smiling. In the lower right corner, a new signature gleamed gold, as if it had just been painted, Helena's name. She smiled through her tears. The painting had finished her story and included her in it. She left the painting on the altar and left the chapel feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in weeks. But when she got home that night, she found something that made her pause at the door. On his desk lay a small white canvas. In the center of it, in almost invisible brushstrokes, was the outline of a new scene, a narrow corridor and a half-open door. Helena understood the message. Perhaps the story of that painting was over, but another was just beginning. End, or just the beginning of a new picture to be revealed.